My name is Caden Kendall, and welcome to Reading, a show where I highlight notable pieces of literature and short stories that I have enjoyed throughout the years. For today's session, we will be reading a short story by Primo Levi. Levi has been recognized for his unique style of prose, showing to be meticulous and done with intent. Certain traits of Levi's writing have been attributed to his work as a chemist, the BBC cleverly describing his work as distilled and noting his distinctly measured verses. The excerpt we read today recounts the stories of mountaineers as they tell of their first excursions to Levi in a camp of a mountain not named. To you I present Primo Levi's Bear Meat. Evenings spent in a mountain hut are among the most sublime and intense that life holds. I mean a real hut, the kind where you seek shelter after a 4, 5, or 6-hour climb and where you find few so-called comforts. Not that chairlifts and cable cars and such comforts are to be looked down on. They are, on the contrary, logical achievements of our society, which is what it is, and must be either accepted or rejected in its totality, and those who are able to reject it are few. But the advent of the chairlift puts an end to a valuable process of natural selection, by which those who reach the hut are sure to find, in its pure state, a small sample of a little-known human subspecies. Its members are people who don't speak much, and of whom others don't speak at all. So there is no mention of them in the literature of most countries, and they should not be confused with other, vaguely similar types who do speak, and of whom others speak: hotshots, extreme climbers, members of famous international expeditions, professionals, etc. All worthy people, but this story is not about them. I arrived at the hut at sunset, and I was very tired. I stayed outside on the wooden porch to consider the frozen mystery of the seracs at my feet until everything had vanished behind silent ghosts of fog, and then I went in. Inside it was almost dark. By the glow of a small carbide lamp, one could distinguish a dozen human figures gathered around 3 or 4 tables. I sat down at a table and opened my backpack. Across from me was a tall, large man, middle-aged, with whom I exchanged a few words about the weather and our plans for the following day. This is a standard conversation, like the classic opening moves of a chess game, where what matters, more than what one says, is the tone in which one says it. We found ourselves in agreement on the fact that the weather was uncertain. It always is in the mountains. When it isn't, it is nonetheless declared to be so, for obvious magical reasons. A little later, 2 lanky men in their 20s entered, with long beards and ravenous eyes. They had arrived from another valley and were attempting an intricate series of crossings. They sat down at our table. After we had eaten, we started to drink. Wine is a more complex substance than one might think, and above 2,000 meters and at close to 0 degrees centigrade, it displays interesting behavioral anomalies. It changes flavor, loses the bite of alcohol, and regains the mildness of the grape from which it comes. One can take it in heavy doses without any undesired effects. In fact, it eliminates fatigue, loosens and warms the limbs, and leads to a fanciful mood. It is no longer a luxury or a vice. It is no longer a luxury or a vice, but a metabolic necessity, like water on the plains. It is a well-known fact that vines grow better on a slope. Could there be a connection? Once we started drinking, the conversation at our table became much less impersonal. Each of us spoke of our initiation, and we established with some surprise that we had all begun our mountaineering careers with an extremely foolish act. As it turned out, the best of these foolish acts, and the best told, was the one recounted by the tall, large man. I was 15. A friend of mine, Severio, was also 15. Another, Luigi, was 17. We had gone out a number of times together to 1,500, 2,000 meters, without a plan or a destination. I should say without a conscious destination, but in essence, impelled by a subtle desire to get ourselves in trouble and then get ourselves out of it, to go straight up the mountain, following your instincts in any direction by the steepest slope, struggle for a quarter of an hour across the mountainside, and then try to get back down. Of course, one also learns a few things in this process. That pine trees, when they're available, make safe and friendly supports, especially during the descent, and that scree is hard to climb but easy to descend by. One learns different types of grasses, those peculiar terraced slopes, and the art of losing the trail and finding it again. Above all, one learns the limits, both quantitative and qualitative, of one's own strength. when the breath, the legs, and the heart give out, and when, so to speak, it's psychosomatic, it's a great school. I wish I had attended it longer. September came and we felt like lions. The G-Pass is 2,400 meters high, 1,100 vertical meters from here. According to the guidebooks, it should be a 3-hour climb, but it'll take us barely 2. There's nothing difficult, just small scree and small rocks. No snow this time of the year. On the other side, there's a 600-meter descent, 1 hour, and we arrive at the Border Patrol hut. You can see it clearly on the map. Then an easy return along the road. We'll leave at day 2. At 4, we're at the top. At 5, at the hut, and home in time for dinner, Luigi said. We met at his house at 2, with our good boots on our feet, but no backpacks, no rope, 100 grams of chocolate in our pockets, and may God forgive us, wearing shorts. We progressed well uphill, first through a pine forest, spurning the mule trail and the shortcuts, and sampling the blueberries, then through an alluvial cone, wasting precious energy. It was the first time we had set off without grown-ups, getting on our nerves with all their advice, without uncles, without experts. We were drunk on our freedom, and because of this, we delighted in the dirtiest high school slang, accompanying it with lofty quotations from the classics. For example, "It is another path that you must take if you would leave this savage wilderness." Or, "That was no path for those with that was no path for," or, "That was no path for," oh my God. Or, "That was no path for those with cloaks of lead, for he and I, he light, I with support, could hardly make it from spur to spur." Forgive me if I get a little carried away. You see, I'm not a Dante expert, and yet, believe me, one of these days an honest man will come along and prove that Dante couldn't have just invented these founding principles of rock climbing. He must have been here or in a similar place. At any rate, we are climbing at a brisk pace, saying and doing foolish things, and so it happened that we reached the pass at 6, not at 4, near collapse, and with a certain trembling in our knees that wasn't just from exhaustion. Severio was the worst off. Luigi and I were already at the top and saw him struggling among the loose rocks 50 meters below us. "Now you must cast aside your laziness," Luigi had the gall to shout at him, at which the poor boy paused to catch his breath, looked upward like Christ on the cross, then clambered up to us and breathed out in a faint voice the implausible yet utterly correct reply, "Go on, for I am strong and confident." When all 3 of us were at the pass, 2 unhappy truths became clear. One, that night was falling, and I swear on this bottle that I have never since seen the darkness fall in the mountains without feeling an emptiness here in the pit of my stomach. The other truth was that we were trapped. From the pass, there was no logical descent to the hut. There was a gentle rocky valley with no human trace, and beyond it a terrifying precipice. Not vertical, no, but of broken rock and gullies of crumbling earth. One of those places no one ever wants to go because you'll break your neck without glory or satisfaction. With less light, we pushed on all the way to the edge. But as for getting down there on our own, we couldn't even consider it. We sat there and started shouting. We took turns. Severio shouted and prayed. Luigi shouted and cursed. I just shouted. We shouted until we were hoarse. Toward midnight, the light in the hut split into 2 lights, and one of the 2 blinked 3 times. It was a signal. We shouted 3 times in response. A faraway voice called, "We're coming," and we replied with a cacophony of shouts. The voice asked, "Where are you?" And without a single match to strike, the 3 of us blurted out confused and irrelevant information, all at the same time. Our rescuers, poor devils, cursed as they climbed and stopped now and then to sing, drink, and laugh loudly. Many years later, I also happened to be a part of a rescue party, so I knew exactly how they felt. These expeditions are tedious and dangerous affairs, and in most cases they can only lead to trouble because no one wants to pay for the emergency supplies, least of all the rescued, who are rarely solvent. They reached us at around 2 a.m, and here I must tell you that, on top of everything else, they were members of the Border Patrol. Once they'd found us, a signal was sent to the valley with a flashlight. "Who are they?" a voice asked from below in dialect. "It's just 3 whiny Gagno," was the fierce reply. Then turning to us, "Is this what they teach you in school?" After that, they tied us up like salami and lowered us down to the valley without talking to us, but stopping often to drink, curse, and guffaw among themselves. I asked the narrator what a gagno was. Gagno, he said, means child, but it's a word loaded with mockery. Second grade kids say it to the first graders. That's how I started. It's not a story to be proud of, you might say, and I'm not, but I'm sure that even this foolish adventure was useful to me later. These are things that make your back broad, which isn't something nature gives everyone. I read somewhere, and the person who wrote this was not a mountaineer but a sailor, that the sea's only gifts are harsh blows and occasionally the chance to feel strong. Now, I don't know much about the sea, but I do know that's the way it is here. And I also know how important it is in life not necessarily to be strong, but to feel strong, to measure yourself at least once, to find yourself in the most ancient human conditions, facing blind, deaf stone alone, with nothing to help you but your own hands and your own head. But excuse me, that's another story. The one I told you ends like this. They called me Whiny Gagno for years. Some people still do, and I assure you I don't mind at all. He drank and silently busied himself with the complex rituals of a pipe smoker. I too started with an extremely foolish act, a voice interjected at this point, and then we noticed that there were no longer 4 of us, but 5 at the table. The voice had come from a man who in the dim light appeared to be thin, balding at the temples with a sharp face, furrowed by shifting wrinkles. He told his story at an uneven pace, swallowing his words and leaving sentences incomplete, as if his tongue had difficulty following the thread of his thoughts. At other times he struggled to find the words and would stop as if under a spell. There were 3 of us too, but not so young, in our 20s. One was Antonio, and I wouldn't want to say much about him, nor would I know how to. He was a fine, handsome youth, smart, sensitive, tenacious, and bold, but with something in him that was elusive and wild. We were at that age when you have the need and the instinct and the immodesty to inflict on others everything that is seething in your head and elsewhere. It's an age that can last a long time, but ends at the first compromise. Yet with him, even at that age, nothing had slipped out of his wrapping of restraint. Nothing escaped from his inner world, though we sensed it to be rich and dense, except some rare illusion dramatically cut short. He was like a cat, if I may put it in this way, whom you live with for years but never allows you to get under his sacred skin. The third was Carlo, our leader. He is dead. It's best to say it right away because one can't help speaking in a different way of the dead than of the living. He died in a way that suited him. Not in the mountains, but the way one dies in the mountains, doing what he had to do, not the kind of duty imposed by someone else or by the state, but the kind that one chooses for oneself. He would have put it differently, called it reaching the end of the line, for example, because he didn't like big words, or for that matter, words. He was the kind of boy who doesn't study for 7 months, who is known as a rebel and a dunce, and then in the 8th month absorbs all the courses as if they were water, and comes through with straight A's. He spent the summer as a shepherd, and in the winter, whenever he got restless, he would tie his skis to his bicycle and go up alone with no money, only an artichoke in one pocket and the other full of salad. He would come back home in the evening, or maybe even the following day, having slept who knows where, and the more storms and hunger he had endured, the happier and healthier he was. When I met him, while I was still a novice, he already had a considerable mountaineering career behind him, but he was reluctant to talk about it. He wasn't the type, which I respect because I'm like that too, who goes into the mountains to be able to tell a story. On the other hand, it was as if no one had taught him how to speak, just as no one had taught him how to ski, because he spoke the way nobody speaks. He voiced only the essence of things. He seemed to be made of steel. If necessary, he could carry a backpack that weighed 30 kilos as if it were nothing, but usually he traveled without a pack. His pockets were enough. Besides the vegetables, they held a piece of bread, a pocket knife, sometimes the Alpine Club guidebook, and always a spool of wire for emergency repairs. He could walk for 2 days without eating, or eat 3 meals in one sitting and then be off. Once I saw him at 3,000 meters in February, in the sleet, bare-chested, eating calmly, a spectacle so upsetting to 2 men nearby that it turned their stomachs. I have a picture at home of the whole scene. He paused as if to catch his breath. People from the other tables had gone to bed. In the sudden silence, we distinctly heard the deep roar of a serac. like the bones of a giant trying in vain to turn over in his bed of a rock. I beg your pardon, I'm no longer young, and I know that it's a desperate endeavor to clothe a man in words. This one in particular, a man like this, when he's dead, is dead forever. He's not the kind to tell you stories about or build monuments to. He's all in his actions, and once those are over, nothing remains. Nothing but precisely words. So every time I try to talk about him, to bring him back to life, as I'm doing now, I feel a great sadness and emptiness, as if I were on a cliff, and I have to be silent or else. He was silent and drank, and then continued. So one Saturday morning in February, Carlo came to us. "Tomorrow, eh?" he said in his language. What he meant was that, since the weather was good, we could leave the next day for the winter ascent of the Tooth of M, which we had been planning for a while. I won't give you all the technical details. I'll tell you briefly that we left the following morning not too early, that we plunged boldly into the fog, that we came out the other side at around 1 in the afternoon. The sun was shining and we were on the ridge of the wrong mountain. Antonia said that we could go 100 meters or so, cross along the mountainside, and climb back up the next mountain. I, who was the most cautious and the least able, said that while we were at it, we could just as well continue along the ridge and arrive at a different peak. It was only 40 meters lower than the other one anyway, and be satisfied with that. Carlo, in perfect bad faith, said with a few harsh, cackling syllables that my proposal was fine, but then again, by the easy northwest ridge, we could reach the Tooth of M in half an hour, and that it wasn't worth being 21 if you don't allow yourself the luxury of taking the wrong path. The worst thing that happens is we taste bear meat. Well, we tasted it, bear meat in abundance. During the course of that night, the longest of my climbing career, it took us 2 hours to descend, feebly assisted by the rope. I'm sure you know what an infernal instrument a frozen rope is. Ours had become a stiff, evil tangle that got caught on all the outcrops and clanged against the rock like a steel cable. At 7, we reached the shore of a small frozen lake. It was dark. We ate the little we had left, built a useless wall of stones to shelter us from the wind, and lay down on the ground to sleep. Huddled side by side, we took turns. The man in the middle slept while the others acted as a buffer. For some reason I can't explain, our watches had stopped. Perhaps because we had forgotten to wind them, and without watches we felt as if time too had frozen. We stood up now and then to get our circulation going, and it was always the same. The wind was always blowing, there was always a semblance of the moon, always in the same spot in the sky, and in front of the moon a fantastic cavalcade of ragged clouds. We had to take our shoes off and put our feet in our backpacks. At the first ghostly light, which seemed to radiate not from the sky but from the snow, we got up, our limbs numb and our eyes glazed from sleeplessness, hunger, and darkness, and had found our shoes so frozen that when struck they rang like bells. In order to put them on, we had to sit on them for half an hour, as if we were hatching eggs. But we returned to the valley on our own, and when the innkeeper asked us, chuckling, how it had gone, all the while stealing glances at our 2-day stubble, we answered without hesitation that it had been a great outing, paid the bill, and left without losing our composure. That was bear meat. Now you must believe me, gentlemen, many years have passed, and I regret having eaten so little of it. I think and hope that each of you has gleaned from life what I have, a certain measure of ease, respect, life, and success. Well, I'll tell you the truth, none of these things, not even remotely, has the taste of bear meat. The taste of being strong and free, which means free to make mistakes. The taste of feeling young in the mountains, of being your own master, which means master of the world. And trust me, I am grateful to Claro for having deliberately gotten us into trouble, for the night he made us spend, and for the various enterprises, senseless only on the surface, that he involved us in later on, and then for various others, not in the mountains, which I got into on my own by following his doctrine. He was a young man full of earthly vigor, who had a wisdom of his own, and may the earth in which he rests, not far from here, lie tight on his bones, and bring the news each year of the return of the sun and of the frost. The second narrator fell silent, and he seemed to me to be looking with some embarrassment toward the 2 young men, as if afraid that he had disturbed or offended them. Then he filled his glass, but he did not drink. His last words had roused in me a rare echo, as if I had heard them somewhere before. And in fact, I later found almost those exact words in a book that is now dear to me, by the same sailor cited by the first man, who had written of the gifts of the sea. That concludes today's reading. Thank you for spending your time with me, and have a good night.